Hello everybody and welcome back. So in this video, we're going to talk about cavitation and flashing that would occur in valves. I've spoken to you about cavitation earlier when we were speaking about cavitation that would occur in pumps, and we were looking at the NPSH of pumps in the suction side. Essentially, cavitation is the same phenomena. It could happen in pumps, it could happen in different unit operations. Right now, we're talking about a control valve. So just as a quick refresher, cavitation occurs when the pressure of the fluid drops below its vapor pressure, and in this case inside the valve, and it usually happens at an area called the vena contracta. And when cavitation occurs, so when the pressure inside the valve drops below the fluid drops below its vapor pressure, what's going to happen is you're going to start vaporizing the fluid. So it's going to cause vapor bubbles to form. The issue is, after these vapor bubbles are created, when the pressure recovers downstream of the valve and rises above its vapor pressure again, these vapor bubbles that formed are going to collapse back into the liquid phase, and then when they collapse back into the liquid phase, you have shock waves that are emitted, which would damage the valve. Flashing is similar because flashing also begins when the fluid's pressure drops below its vapor pressure at that same location, the vena contracta location, and I'm going to tell you where the vena contracta in the valve is. You have the same phenomena occurring, so you have vapor bubbles forming. However, unlike cavitation, the pressure does not recover downstream of the valve, and so as a result, the fluid remains in its vapor, or at that point, two-phase state. So you have liquid and vapor at equilibrium after exiting the valve, and so the vapor bubbles do not contract. So I'm saying that there's a point inside the valve that the pressure drop might be too high. So what happens is you have a very low pressure inside the valve that causes the fluid to vaporize, and that's because the pressure is lower than the vapor pressure of the fluid you're using. You might wonder, why would the pressure inside the valve drop so much? Well, if you look at what's happening inside the valve, as the area inside the valve where the fluid is passing is restricted, it could be restricted so much so that the velocity of the fluid is so high. And according to the Bernoulli principle, if the velocity is increased or is too high, according to the Bernoulli principle, in that region, the pressure is too low. And so if the pressure is too low and the velocity is too high, you might reach a point where the pressure drops so much below fluid's vapor pressure. And if the pressure is below a fluid's vapor pressure, then at that point you have bubbles forming. But then after this fluid leaves this restricted area, the velocity recovers, or the velocity then slows down again, but the pressure starts recovering. The pressure starts recovering up to the exit pressure of the valve. And so as the velocity then goes back down, because now the narrowed area, the fluid has passed that narrowed area, and the velocity is getting lowered because now the area is larger. The pressure now is no longer very low. It's recovering to what would normally be the exit pressure of the valve, which is at P2. So even though when you look at a valve, you don't see all of that, because when you have a pressure gauge at the inlet of the valve and a pressure gauge at the outlet of the valve, you only read P1 and P2. You don't see what's happening inside the valve. So if you look at this chart and you think of this, or if you look at this picture and you think of this as an X-ray of what's happening inside the valve, well, the valve would restrict the flow, because as you throttle that valve, you create more of a restriction. And if that restriction is too much, and if the opening is very narrow, you would have a very high velocity, which as a result would cause the pressure to be very low at that area. Now, this area is called the vena contracta, which refers to the point of minimum flow area. So that's the point where you have the highest restriction. And at the point where you have the highest restriction, you must have the maximum velocity in the fluid stream. And at that point, you obviously can have a very low pressure to the point that you could start causing vaporization. So, and valves have different characteristics. So the amount of how much the pressure recovers to the outlet pressure is something that is a valve characteristic. And there are factors that valve manufacturers use to characterize how how much cavitation would occur. And these are things that we're going to look at together. And this is another picture which shows you that at the vena contracta, that's when you have a restricted area. And in this restricted area, you have high flow velocity. So the only issue with the vena contracta is when you have the pressure so low that you start having cavitation occurring. So there's nothing wrong with the vena contracta. It's just the vena contracta refers to the point of the most restriction, where you have the maximum velocity. And this is something that naturally would occur anyways when you have any restrictions. And so there isn't a problem with this. It's only when you have cavitation or flashing that's occurring. And flashing would occur if you have this pressure that goes below the vapor pressure, so you start forming vapor bubbles, but the outlet pressure of the valve doesn't go above the vapor pressure of the fluid. So then the fluid stays in gas form, or that it's equilibrium in the two-phase form as it exits the valve. And so if you open the valve, you'll see gas and liquid coming off from that valve. And the gas is just the vaporized liquid. So here is another depiction of it. So here are another two pictures. And you have the circle here is highlighted at the vena contracta. You could see that at the inlet you have P1, and as the fluid travels, the pressure drops. And this point is the PVC, refers to the pressure of the vena contracta. You could see that the pressure is the lowest at the highest restriction point, or exactly after that, at the restriction point. And then as it travels to the exit of the valve, as the fluid travels back to the exit of the valve and the narrowing opens again, you have the pressure recovers to what it would be at P2. And depending on the characteristic of the valve, you could have a high recovery. So that means P2 would be a lot higher than a valve with a lower recovery, where P2 would be a lot larger. So obviously the pressure drop across the valve is just P1 minus P2. So you could see for high recovery valves, P1 minus P2 would be a low pressure drop valve generally. And for a low recovery valve, P1 minus P2 would be higher. So in this valve, in a low recovery valve, you generally have higher pressure drops. And you could see if the vena contracta is lowered below the vapor pressure, then the fluid will vaporize. And if the pressure at the outlet, so P2, is lower than the vapor pressure, then the fluid will remain in its vapor phase even after the vena contracta, and that just means that you have flashing. And if P2 is greater than the vapor pressure, then the fluid will have to collapse again into the liquid phase, and then that means what you had there was cavitation. So this is something that you want to avoid. You want to avoid having the pressure at the vena contracta lower than the fluid's vapor pressure, because you want to avoid cavitation to begin with. Okay, so now that you understand the concept of cavitation and flashing, and you know that you want to avoid it, how could you predict, or how could you mathematically express and figure out when cavitation will occur for the valve that you're sizing. So in the next lecture, we're going to look at the set of equations and the mathematical relationships that you could use to predict when cavitation will occur so that you could avoid it when you are sizing your valve. So without further ado, see you in the next lecture.